The Revolutionary War, also known as the American War of Independence, began in 1775 and lasted until 1783. It was the conflict in which the 13 American colonies fought to gain independence from British rule. Tensions had been rising for years due to British taxation policies, lack of colonial representation in Parliament, and a growing sense of American identity. The war officially began with the battles of Lexington and Concord and soon escalated into a full-scale revolution. Under the leadership of figures like George Washington, the Continental Army faced a far superior British military. However, the Americans used their knowledge of the terrain, guerrilla tactics, and the strategic support of foreign allies, most notably France, to level the playing field. The turning point came with the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, which convinced France to enter the war in support of the colonies. The conflict concluded in 1781 after the decisive American and French victory at the Siege of Yorktown, where British General Cornwallis surrendered. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, officially recognizing American independence. The Revolutionary War not only gave birth to a new nation, but also laid the ideological foundation for democratic governance and individual liberties in the United States. The War of 1812 was fought between the United States and Great Britain from 1812 to 1815. Often called the Second War of Independence, it stemmed from British restrictions on American trade during the Napoleonic Wars, the impressment of American sailors into the British Navy, and British support for Native American tribes resisting U.S. expansion in the Northwest Territory. The war was marked by several poorly coordinated invasions of Canada, which were largely unsuccessful. However, American naval victories on the Great Lakes and at sea helped boost morale. One of the most iconic moments came in 1814 when British forces burned Washington, D.C., including the White House and Capitol, in retaliation for American attacks in Canada. That same year, American forces successfully defended Baltimore, inspiring Francis Scott Key to write The Star-Spangled Banner. The war ended in a stalemate with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent in December 1814, restoring pre-war boundaries. However, the Battle of New Orleans, fought after the treaty was signed but before news reached the U.S., was a resounding American victory under General Andrew Jackson and helped shape a sense of national pride. Though the war resolved few of the issues that caused it, it marked the beginning of a more assertive American foreign policy. The Mexican-American War took place between 1846 and 1848, sparked by the United States annexation of Texas and disputes over its southern border. Mexico considered Texas a rebellious province, while the U.S. claimed the Rio Grande as the rightful boundary. When fighting broke out, President James K. Polk used the opportunity to push for the fulfillment of Manifest Destiny, the belief that the U.S. was destined to expand from coast to coast. American forces, led by Generals Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, won a series of key battles. Taylor's victory at Buena Vista and Scott's amphibious assault on Veracruz paved the way for the capture of Mexico City. The war was characterized by the professionalization of the U.S. Army and the use of modern tactics that would later influence the Civil War. Mexican resistance was fierce, but ultimately overwhelmed by the better equipped and more organized American forces. The war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, which ceded vast territories to the U.S., including present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of several other states. This massive land acquisition reshaped the American map and intensified debates over slavery, as politicians grappled with whether the new territories would allow enslaved labor. The Mexican-American War had lasting effects on both nations, altering the balance of power in North America. The American Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865, was the most devastating conflict in U.S. history. It pitted the northern states, known as the Union, against the southern states that had seceded to form the Confederate States of America. The primary cause of the war was the deep divide over slavery and states' rights, particularly the southern states' desire to maintain an economy dependent on enslaved labor. The war began with the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Major battles such as Antietam, Gettysburg, and Shiloh demonstrated the war's scale and brutality. The Union, under President Abraham Lincoln and General Ulysses S. Grant, implemented strategies such as blockading southern ports and capturing key territories along the Mississippi River. The Confederacy, led by Jefferson Davis and General Robert E. Lee, fought fiercely, but was ultimately worn down by the Union's greater manpower and industrial capacity. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 redefined the war as a fight against slavery. By April 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, ending the conflict. The Civil War resulted in more than 600,000 deaths and left large parts of the South in ruins. But it also preserved the Union and led to the abolition of slavery through the 13th Amendment, fundamentally transforming the nation. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was a brief but significant conflict that marked the emergence of the United States as a global power. It was triggered by American support for Cuban independence from Spanish rule and fueled by sensationalist journalism after the mysterious explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. Public outcry pushed the U.S. to declare war on Spain in April of that year. The war was fought on multiple fronts, including Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. American forces quickly overwhelmed the Spanish military with decisive victories such as the naval battle of Manila Bay and the charge up San Juan Hill by Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. Within a few months, Spain was forced to surrender. The Treaty of Paris ended the war in December 1898. As a result, the United States gained control of former Spanish territories, including Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. While Cuba was granted formal independence, the U.S. retained significant influence over its affairs. The Spanish-American War signaled the start of American imperialism and raised questions about the nation's role on the world stage. World War I, often called the Great War, lasted from 1914 to 1918, though the United States did not enter until 1917. For the first few years, the U.S. remained neutral, while the Allied and Central Powers fought a brutal and stagnant war in Europe. However, German unrestricted submarine warfare and the discovery of the Zimmermann telegram, where Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico, drew America into the conflict. Under President Woodrow Wilson, the United States declared war on Germany in April 1917. American troops, known as the American Expeditionary Force, arrived in Europe in large numbers, helping to tip the balance in favor of the Allies. Battles like the Meuse-Argonne Offensive showcased the growing strength of U.S. forces and their ability to support war-weary European armies. The war ended with the signing of the armistice on November 11, 1918. Wilson proposed a post-war peace plan known as the 14 Points, including the creation of the League of Nations, though the U.S. Senate ultimately rejected joining it. World War I cost millions of lives and reshaped the geopolitical landscape, while establishing the United States as a significant actor in global affairs. World War II was the deadliest and most widespread conflict in human history. It lasted from 1939 to 1945, with the United States joining in December 1941 after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The war pitted the Allied powers, including the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union, against the Axis powers of Germany, Japan, and Italy. For the U.S., it became a total war effort that mobilized the economy, military, and civilian population on an unprecedented scale. American forces fought across both the European and Pacific theaters. In Europe, U.S. troops played a pivotal role in the D-Day landings in Normandy, France, and in the liberation of Nazi-occupied territories. In the Pacific, fierce battles like Iwo Jima, Midway, and Okinawa brought American forces closer to Japan. The war reached its devastating conclusion when the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, leading to Japan's surrender. The end of World War II established the United States as a global superpower. It also ushered in a new international order, including the founding of the United Nations and the beginning of the Cold War. More than 400,000 American service members lost their lives, and the war reshaped the political, economic, and social landscape of the world. The Korean War began in 1950 when North Korean communist forces invaded South Korea. The United States, under the banner of the United Nations, intervened to support South Korea, while China backed the North. The conflict was one of the first major proxy wars of the Cold War era, with the U.S. determined to stop the spread of communism in Asia. The war seesawed back and forth, with dramatic offensives on both sides. American-led forces pushed deep into North Korea, but were pushed back by Chinese intervention. The conflict eventually stabilized near the original boundary, the 38th parallel. Brutal conditions, heavy casualties, and political complexities made the war deeply unpopular at home. An armistice was signed in 1953, but no formal peace treaty was ever concluded, leaving North and South Korea technically still at war. The Korean War cost over 36,000 American lives and established the precedent of U.S. military engagement in global conflicts without a formal declaration of war. It also cemented the United States' long-term military presence in East Asia. The Vietnam War was a prolonged and controversial conflict that spanned from the late 1950s to 1975, with the most intense U.S. involvement occurring between 1965 and 1973. The United States entered the war to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, supporting the government of South Vietnam against the communist North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong insurgents. Despite superior military technology, the U.S. struggled in Vietnam due to guerrilla tactics, dense jungle terrain, and lack of public support. Battles such as the Tet Offensive in 1968 shocked the American public and eroded confidence in government statements. The war also caused deep divisions at home, sparking widespread protests and raising ethical questions about military intervention. U.S. forces gradually withdrew under the policy of Vietnamization, and by 1975, Saigon fell to North Vietnamese forces. More than 58,000 Americans were killed, and the war left a lasting scar on the national psyche. It prompted a reevaluation of American foreign policy and military engagement, and the effects of the Vietnam War continue to shape U.S. political and cultural discourse. The Gulf War, also known as Operation Desert Storm, took place in 1990 to 1991 after Iraq, under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, invaded the neighboring country of Kuwait. The United States led a coalition of international forces to expel Iraqi troops and defend the sovereignty of Kuwait. The operation marked the beginning of high-tech warfare, showcasing precision airstrikes and satellite-guided missiles. After months of diplomatic efforts and military buildup, the coalition launched a massive air campaign, followed by a swift ground invasion. Within 100 hours of ground combat, Iraqi forces were driven out of Kuwait. The war was televised globally and portrayed as a decisive and clean military victory, with relatively few American casualties compared to previous wars. However, the conflict did not remove Saddam Hussein from power, and many of the underlying tensions in the region remained unresolved. The Gulf War also marked the beginning of a sustained American military presence in the Middle East, which would have significant implications for future conflicts, including the Iraq War a decade later. The war in Afghanistan began in October 2001 in direct response to the September 11 terrorist attacks. The United States, backed by NATO allies, invaded Afghanistan to dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban regime that had provided them safe haven. It became the longest war in U.S. history, lasting nearly 20 years. Initially, the Taliban was quickly overthrown, and many al-Qaeda leaders were killed or captured. However, efforts to rebuild Afghanistan and defeat a growing insurgency proved far more difficult. The war evolved into a nation-building effort, with American troops engaged in combat, training Afghan forces, and helping to establish a democratic government. Over time, public support waned as casualties mounted and progress remained fragile. The U.S. began reducing troop levels in the 2010s, and in 2021, a full withdrawal was completed. The Taliban rapidly regained control, raising questions about the effectiveness and cost of the intervention. The war in Afghanistan claimed the lives of over 2,400 American service members and reshaped global counterterrorism policy. The Iraq War began in 2003 with a U.S.-led invasion aimed at toppling Saddam Hussein's regime. The Bush administration argued that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and posed a threat to global security. Despite controversy and lack of UN authorization, American and coalition forces launched Operation Iraqi Freedom in March 2003. Saddam's government fell quickly, but the conflict did not end. Iraq descended into chaos, with sectarian violence, insurgency, and terrorism destabilizing the region. No WMDs were found, which intensified public criticism and distrust. The U.S. faced a prolonged occupation and complex nation-building challenges as it tried to establish a democratic government. American forces officially withdrew in 2011, though troops later returned in limited numbers to combat ISIS. The Iraq War cost over 4,000 American lives and billions of dollars. Its legacy remains hotly debated, influencing how future interventions are judged and shaping the political landscape, both in the Middle East and at home. The story of America's wars is also the story of how a nation rose, struggled, and defined its place in the world, through victory, loss, and change. Each conflict shaped not just the country, but history itself. If you enjoyed this journey through time, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful documentaries like this one. And if you're curious about humanity's greatest achievements, watch our video on Every Wonder of the World Explained, linked right here on screen and in the description below. Thanks for watching.